Hello, my name is Jocelyn. I'm a Wright State University graduate student getting my master's degree in industrial design and digital learning. Today, I want to teach you a little bit of basic information about the cognitive load theory and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. First and foremost, the goal of learning is to achieve meaningful learning or knowledge transfer. That's achieved when a student is able to store, recall, apply, and share information that they've just learned. The cognitive load theory kind of breaks down how all of this happens. So the cognitive load theory describes the human cognitive process in two ways. There's the cognitive architecture and the cognitive load conditions. Our working memory is very limited. It can only hold between 7 to 9 pieces of information for about 20 seconds. Because our working memory is so limited, we do run into some distractions. The information goes into the working memory, but at a very specific pace. So what we know is the information goes into the working memory. It's then labeled as important by the schema and then integrated into the long-term memory. The schema is like a file folder, which will hold that information and organize it in the long-term memory. Because the working memory is so limited, we often run into distractions, and we only have so many resources available that'll help us facilitate cognitive architecture. So the schema or the file folder then organizes it into the long-term memory, similar to a file cabinet. Once it's stored in the long-term memory, it can be recalled, it can be shared, and it can be applied for future situations. Cognitive load refers to how much information we can process at one time. So a cognitive load condition refers to the amount of working memory resources we have available to kind of transfer this new information from our working memory into our long-term memory. So there's 3 cognitive loads. There's intrinsic, extraneous, and germane. Intrinsic cognitive load refers to the difficulty of the information. So the more difficult the question or the assignment that's being provided, the more interacting elements the student has to kind of figure out. The more interacting elements or the more difficulty equals a higher intrinsic cognitive load. The extraneous cognitive load refers to the external distractions. So imagine if the AC in the classroom goes off and the heat in that classroom just kind of exceeds a comfortable level. That can make the extraneous cognitive load higher for all of those students because they're more uncomfortable and less likely to be able to focus. The germane load, however, refers to the amount of resources needed to retain information or transfer information into our long-term memory. And the goal then is to stay in the germane load process because that is the effective load. However, in order to do so, we do need to manage the intrinsic load or the difficulty and reduce the extraneous load or the distractions to be in the effective or germane load. That's going to increase the meaningful learning or the knowledge transfer. So just to recap, cognitive learning theory states we receive new information, which is very limited into our working memory. It's stored by our schema into the long-term memory, and that again is cognitive architecture. Let's go ahead and discuss the load sizes. It stores things in the long-term memory, and we have to manage the intrinsic load, okay, and reduce the extraneous load to achieve higher germane load, okay? That's where we're going to utilize all available resources and achieve learning. Moving on to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, it's very similar to the cognitive learning theory in such that it discusses the way that people process information. We receive it through our sensory memory, it's processed in our working memory, and then integrated into our long-term memory. The cognitive theory of multimedia learning has 3 different assumptions. The first is the dual channel assumption. The dual channel assumption says that we receive information through multiple channels. So we use our eyes to see information, and that processes information, and we use our ears to hear information, and that also processes information, giving us a multiple ways to receive content. The limited processing assumption just assumes that we have a limited working memory. Okay, so there's not much space available for us to hold on to information, which is similar to the cognitive load theory. Finally, the active processing assumption assumes that if you are using multimedia, you do have an engaged learner, and that learner is actually storing information in the working memory and then organizing that new information to then be integrated into the long-term memory. So the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, much like the cognitive load theory, makes reference to strain placed on the working memory. So when we are learning new things, there are certain things that interfere with the way that we process our information. Similar to the cognitive load theory, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning uses different terms. Okay, so there are the extraneous processing, which is similar to the extraneous cognitive load. And then we have the essential processing, which is similar to the intrinsic cognitive load. And lastly, we have the generative processing, which is similar to the germane load. Ultimately, the goal of the cognitive theory of multimedia learning is to reduce the extraneous processing and manage the essential processing to encourage generative processing, which again is where long-term memories are stored and meaningful learning is achieved. So there are so many similarities and differences to these two theories. The certain similarities I want to go ahead and point out are that they both discuss the idea of cognitive load, or the ability to retain certain information in the working memory and transfer that to the long-term memory. However, they also agree that there are some distractions or some things that are placed as a strain on our working memory that we want to manage and again minimize. They also agree that the long-term memory is limitless and that the working memory is very limited. There are some differences in these two theories. One of them is that the cognitive theory of multimedia learning has the idea that there are dual channels. So again, you'll be able to receive information both from your vision as well as your hearing. Another difference is that the cognitive theory of multimedia learning uses exclusively pictures and words, as opposed to the cognitive load theory, which says that information can be learned and it can be applied to any learning environment. So in a training capacity, in an educational capacity, K-12 or higher education, anytime where learning is being done, the cognitive load theory can be applied. However, with the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, that is exclusive to multimedia. So that will definitely only be revolving around pictures and words. I hope I was able to sum up these two theories for you, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. I'll see you guys next time.